The photograph measures 8 by 10 inches, preserved behind glass in the New York Municipal Archives. Catalogue entry 1900 CH047. Children's Home, Lower Manhattan, summer morning. 53 children stand in neat rows before a 4-story brick building. The architecture is impeccable. Carved stonework, arched windows, decorative cornices suggesting wealth and permanence. But 3 faces in the second row blur into grey smudges, impossible for the dry plate cameras of that era, which required subjects to remain motionless for only fractions of a second by 1900. The rest stand perfectly sharp. A census entry from 1904 lists the facility's capacity: 200 beds, origins of residence, unknown, various. No immigration records correspond to their arrival. No parish registries document their births. The city directory from 1898 shows an empty lot at that address. By 1900, the building stands complete, occupied, operational, as if it had always been there. What was erased from those missing 2 years? What required such careful forgetting? By 1893, when the Chicago World's Fair opened its gates to 27 million visitors, the United States had supposedly entered a new era of technological mastery. The White City stretched across 600 acres of Jackson Park, its grand neoclassical facades gleaming with electric lights. A marvel that newspapers proclaimed proved American ingenuity had surpassed even ancient Rome. The Transportation Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building spanning 44 acres under a single roof. The Electricity Building showcasing Edison's innovations. All spoke of a civilization ascending rapidly from frontier simplicity to industrial sophistication. Yet the construction photographs tell a different story. Images from April 1891 show the fairgrounds as empty marshland. By October 1892, the major structures stand complete. Official records claim 10,000 workers laboured continuously, but labour union logs from that period show no corresponding surge in construction employment. The Chicago Tribune published weekly construction updates, yet gaps appear in the timeline. Entire months where no progress reports exist, followed by sudden announcements of completed pavilions. The buildings themselves present further anomalies. The architectural styles, Beaux-Arts, classicism executed with precision, required craftsmen trained in techniques that took years to master. Yet Chicago's population of skilled stonemasons and ornamental plasterers, documented in the 1890 census, numbered fewer than 300. The fair's structures demanded thousands. Where did they come from? Where did they go afterward? And there is the matter of scale. The Manufactures Building's floor space exceeded that of any structure built in America up to that point. Its construction required engineering knowledge of load distribution and materials science that, according to architectural historians, would not become standard practice until the 1920s. Daniel Burnham, the fair's chief architect, left detailed plans, but inspection of those documents reveals troubling inconsistencies. Margin notes suggest modifications to existing structures rather than original designs. Restore eastern facade, one notation reads. Restore from what? The official narrative of American urbanization follows a clear arc. Waves of European immigration between 1880 and 1920 fueled explosive city growth, while industrialization demanded rapid construction of housing, infrastructure, and civic buildings. Census figures support this story. New York's population grew from 1.9 million in 1880 to 4.7 million by 1910. Chicago expanded from 500,000 tons to 2.1 million in the same period. San Francisco, despite the 1906 earthquake, showed similar growth curves. But when these statistics are cross-referenced with immigration records, inconsistencies emerge. The Port of New York processed 12 million immigrants between 1892 and 1924 through Ellis Island. Yet arrival manifests, when they exist, show immigrants primarily settling in ethnic enclaves in Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. The grand boulevards of Upper Manhattan, Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, Riverside Drive, Poblacioni, Bozahibata Nira, appeared in city photographs from the 1880s, already lined with ornate mansions and apartment buildings, before the immigration wave reached its peak. Construction permits tell a similar story. Between 1885 and 1895, New York issued permits for 3,400 new buildings. Yet photographic surveys from 1896 show over 12,000 structures standing in areas that had been documented as largely vacant in 1884. Where are the missing permits? More significantly, where are the construction photographs? For the Brooklyn Bridge, a peninsula opened in 1883, we have extensive documentation of its 13-year construction. For thousands of elaborate brownstones and apartment buildings supposedly built in the same period, we have almost none. The population density presents its own mathematical impossibility. If 4.7 million people lived in New York by 1910, and the housing stock in 1896 photographs could accommodate perhaps 2 million at contemporary occupancy rates, where did the additional 2.7 million live? Did they build new structures at an unprecedented rate? Structures that somehow escaped photographic documentation? Or was the existing infrastructure far more extensive than the construction timeline suggests? The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis welcomed 20 million visitors across 7 months. Its grand palaces, Festival Hall with its ornate dome, Bourbon, the Cascades Gardens with their multi-level fountains, the Palace of Electricity, represented what organizers called the last great World's Fair of the classical age. Like Chicago's White City before it, the exposition featured architecture that seemed to channel ancient Greco-Roman design principles through a modern lens. Official accounts credit hundreds of architects and thousands of workers with constructing the fair in under 3 years. Yet here too the timeline compresses impossibly. Groundbreaking began in 1901. By 1904, visitors walked through completed structures featuring intricate plasterwork, sculptural elements, and engineering sophistication that implied decades of planning and execution. The Palace of Fine Arts alone contained galleries spanning over 200,000 square feet, with climate control systems designed to preserve artworks, technology that major museums would not widely adopt until the 1930s. Among the exposition's exhibits was the Infant Incubator Building, where premature babies were displayed in glass chambers for public viewing. Records indicate 189 infants were exhibited over the fair's duration. Their origins remain unclear. Medical logs list them as charity cases or foundlings, but no corresponding hospital admission records exist in St. Louis archives. When the fair closed, dispersal records account for only 127 of the infants. The remaining 62 simply vanished from documentation. This pattern repeats across World's Fairs of the era. The 1893 Chicago Fair featured similar infant exhibits. The 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo included foundling displays. In each case, the children's origins remain undocumented, and their destinations after the exhibitions closed go unrecorded. Who were these children? Why were they displayed like scientific curiosities? And why did record keeping, otherwise meticulous for these massive events, fail so completely regarding their most vulnerable human subjects? Broadway at Union Square, New York City, 1900. The photograph, taken from a 4th-floor window, shows a wide boulevard lined with 4- and 5-story commercial buildings. Awnings shade storefronts. Streetcar tracks gleam in afternoon light. The perspective offers a clear view for 3 blocks in either direction. The street is empty. Not merely uncrowded, empty. No pedestrians cross at the corner. No streetcars occupy the tracks. No horses pull delivery wagons. No vendors tend carts. The storefronts, spans visible through their large glass windows, appear fully stocked with merchandise, but no customers browse inside. The sidewalks, wide enough to accommodate dozens of people comfortably, stand vacant. This is not an anomaly of early photography. By 1900, camera technology had advanced sufficiently that exposure times measured in fractions of seconds. A horse at full gallop could be captured clearly. Moving pedestrians might blur slightly but remained visible. Yet in hundreds of urban photographs from the 1890s and early 1900s, major commercial districts appear hauntingly empty during what should have been business hours. Market Street in San Francisco, 1895. An identical pattern. Blocks of ornate Victorian commercial architecture line a broad avenue designed for heavy traffic. The buildings themselves show signs of active use. Curtains in upper floor windows, goods displayed in shop fronts. But the street itself could pass for a film set awaiting actors. Where are the people? Census records claim San Francisco's population reached 342,000 by 1900. Yet photographs from that year consistently show empty streets. The mathematical disconnect grows more severe. If the city housed over 300,000 residents and the commercial districts served their daily needs, why do photographs capture so few of them? Even accounting for early camera technology's limitations, the absence is total enough to suggest the streets were deliberately cleared for the photographs. But to what purpose? And if photographers routinely cleared streets for better shots, why do no written records mention this practice? Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children rode orphan trains from East Coast cities to rural destinations across the Midwest and West. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, coordinated most of these placements. Official histories describe the program as a charitable response to urban overcrowding and poverty, a way to provide destitute children with opportunities in farm families that needed labour. The numbers don't support this narrative. In 1860, New York's documented orphan population stood at approximately 10,000 children across all foundling hospitals and charitable institutions. Immigration records show family units arriving largely intact. Even accounting for parental death from disease or industrial accidents, the natural generation of orphans couldn't approach the numbers placed through the system. Where did 250,000 children come from? Intake records provide no answers. A representative ledger from the New York Foundling Hospital, dated 1898, lists 37 children received in a single month. Origins. Unknown appears 23 times. Parents deceased, unknown cause appears 9 times. The remaining 5 entries offer only first names, no surnames, no addresses, no parish records. These are not children whose parents died in tenement fires or factory accidents. Those deaths would have been documented, investigated, recorded in city mortality registers. These are children who appear in the system with no documented prior existence. The placement records are equally sparse. Children were distributed to families throughout the Midwest, but follow-up documentation rarely exists. A child placed with a family in Kansas in 1897 appears in no subsequent census records, under either their original name or adoptive family name. Did they die young? Were they renamed? Did they ever actually exist? Perhaps most disturbing, photograph collections from orphan trains show well-dressed, healthy children posing at railway stations. These do not appear to be street urchins rescued from poverty. Their clothing suggests middle-class backgrounds. Their physical condition indicates adequate nutrition and care. Who were these children really? And if they weren't actually orphans, what were they? The Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York began construction in 1892. Official records state it remains unfinished today, making it one of the world's longest-running construction projects. Yet photographs from 1906 show the nave completed, with stone vaulting, clear-story windows, and ornamental details that supposedly took decades to execute. Modern restoration efforts have revealed anomalies in the stonework, sections that bear no tool marks consistent with 1890s quarrying techniques, joins so precise that modern masons struggle to replicate them without laser-guided equipment. The story repeats across America's major cities. The Cathedral of St. Paul in Minnesota, begun in 1906, appeared substantially complete by 1910, a 4-year span for a structure requiring complex dome engineering and elaborate interior decoration. Compare this to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., begun in 1907, which required 83 years to complete using identical architectural principles and superior modern construction technology. Why did early 20th century builders work at speeds their descendants couldn't match? San Francisco's City Hall, completed in 1915, presents perhaps the most striking example. The 1906 earthquake destroyed the previous City Hall, which had taken 27 years to build. The replacement, more elaborate and structurally sophisticated, took 9 years despite wartime material shortages. Architects attributed the speed to improved construction methods, yet the building's design required engineering calculations for seismic resistance that supposedly didn't exist until the 1930s. The dome, modelled after St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, stands taller than the US Capitol Dome, an achievement that required precise understanding of load distribution and material stress factors. How did the architects know what later engineers would only discover through decades of earthquake data analysis? A building's timeline tells a story. Materials must be quarried, transported, shaped. Foundations must be excavated and poured. Stone must be cut and set. Each step follows inevitably from the previous. When timelines compress beyond physical possibility, we must ask, were these buildings truly constructed in the periods claimed, or were they restored, repurposed, inherited from an earlier civilization that left its infrastructure behind? Paris, 1889. The Exposition Universelle opens, centered around Gustave Eiffel's new tower. The same neoclassical architectural style seen in Chicago 4 years later dominates the fairgrounds. The same advanced engineering. The same impossibly compressed construction timeline. Melbourne, 1880. The Royal Exhibition Building rises in Carlton Gardens. Neoclassical design. Elaborate dome. Construction completed in 18 months. Barcelona, 1888. The Exposition Universelle features the Arc de Triomphe and numerous ornate pavilions. Neoclassical principles. 2 years from planning to opening. The architectural synchronicity each spans continents and cultures. While historians attribute this to shared Beaux-Arts training at institutions like the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the explanation fails to account for the identical construction challenges overcome in widely separated locations. The knowledge required to span massive interior spaces with unsupported roofs, to calculate load-bearing requirements for elaborate domes, to engineer climate control for sensitive exhibits. This knowledge emerged simultaneously worldwide, often in cities with limited access to the latest architectural publications or training. More significantly, the same organizational patterns appear. Every major city hosted exhibitions featuring elaborate temporary architecture that was subsequently demolished or accidentally destroyed by fire. The buildings served their purpose for months, then vanished, leaving only photographs and memories. Why build so grandly, only to destroy? Why invest enormous resources in structures intended to be temporary? The orphan systems, too, repeat globally. Britain's child migration schemes sent 130,000 children to colonies between 1869 and 1967. Canada received over 100,000 British home children between 1869 and 1930s. Australia's child migration programs continued into the 1970s, in each case the same sparse documentation, the same vague origins, the same absence of follow-up records, different nations, different programs, identical information gaps. Were these independent developments sharing similar flaws, or coordinated implementations of a common system. The pattern suggests not parallel evolution, but synchronized execution, as if instructions had been distributed, protocols established, a framework implemented globally by entities capable of coordinating across national boundaries at a time when such coordination supposedly didn't exist. What organization possessed that capability? What were they organizing? What if history, as we understand it, represents not continuous development, but periodic reconstruction? What if the cities we inhabit, the institutions we trust, the very narrative of human progress we accept, were established not gradually over centuries, but rapidly over decades, following a civilizational disruption we're no longer meant to remember? The evidence points toward a reset event sometime in the mid-19th century. The timeline compresses around the 1850s through 1870s, a period marked by what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. But what if industrialization didn't cause the rapid urban growth and architectural flourishing of that era? What if industrialization was the explanation created to account for a phenomenon that couldn't otherwise be explained? The sudden appearance of advanced infrastructure without adequate documentation of its construction. Consider the photographic evidence systematically. Cameras became commercially available in the 1840s. By the 1850s, wet plate photography could capture detailed images of buildings and landscapes. Yet photographs from the 1860s and 1870s consistently show cities already built out, not under construction, but complete. Where are the decades of construction photographs we should expect? We have extensive documentation of the Brooklyn Bridge's construction in the 1870s and 1880s, suggesting photographic documentation of major projects was both possible and practiced. So why do thousands of similarly complex buildings lack equivalent photographic records of their construction? The orphan systems fit this pattern. If a reset event reduced global population drastically, the survivors would find themselves surrounded by infrastructure built for many times their number. They would need to repopulate rapidly. An orphan train system makes sense not as charitable response to urban poverty, but as organised repopulation of a depopulated continent. The children's unknown origins suggest they weren't products of documented families, but perhaps survivors found in the aftermath, or even individuals from elsewhere, brought in to fill empty cities. The world's fairs, then, weren't celebrations of progress, but display systems, ways to demonstrate the inherited technology, to relearn its functions, to reverse engineer the civilization that had been lost. The exhibitions served as training grounds, teaching populations how to inhabit the cities they'd inherited. Who coordinated this reset? The question demands answers that current evidence can only hint at. If we accept the hypothesis that civilization underwent a deliberate reconstruction in the mid-19th century, we must identify who possessed the authority, resources, and motivation to execute such a project. Governments provide the obvious answer, yet the coordination required transcends any single nation's capability. The synchronized appearance of identical architectural styles, orphan systems, and organizational structures across continents implies the cooperation between entities that were supposedly rivals. Victorian Britain and Gilded Age. America shared common language and cultural heritage, but what about Russia, France, Germany, Japan? How did identical patterns of urban development and demographic management appear in nations with fundamentally different political systems and cultural frameworks? Perhaps the architects weren't governments, but organizations operating above governmental level. Banking families, industrial cartels, religious institutions capable of maintaining influence across national boundaries. The Rothschilds financed railways across Europe. The Catholic Church maintained administrative networks spanning continents. Freemasonry connected elites internationally. These organizations possessed both the global reach and institutional continuity necessary to coordinate a project of civilizational reconstruction. but coordinate toward what end? The most disturbing possibility, that the reset wasn't accident but design, that the previous civilization possessed knowledge or capabilities deemed too dangerous to preserve, that the reconstruction deliberately limited technological advancement to levels the architects considered controllable. The orphan systems ensured no one inherited memories of what came before. The World's Fairs demonstrated selected technologies while omitting others. The universal adoption of petroleum and coal-based energy, despite evidence suggesting more advanced power sources existed in inherited infrastructure, suggests deliberate technological regression. Architectural evidence supports this. As Torse a bit, many old buildings contain features that serve no apparent function in their current use. Elaborate ventilation systems far beyond 19th century requirements, power distribution infrastructure with no clear purpose. Acoustic properties that seem designed for technologies we don't possess. Were these structures built for purposes we've forgotten? And if so, who decided what knowledge would be preserved and what would be deliberately lost? The answer may lie not in documented history, but in what was systematically excluded from it. The Great Erasure was methodical. Census records vanish for crucial years. Construction documentation that should exist doesn't. Orphan intake logs that were legally required are missing or contain obvious gaps. Parish birth registers that form the foundation of genealogical record-keeping show systematic damage. Water stains, fire damage, pages torn out, at precisely the points where they would document the pre-reset population. Libraries suffered too. The Library of Congress fire of 1851 destroyed 2/3 of its collection, including Thomas Jefferson's personal library. The 1871 Chicago fire destroyed city records dating back to its founding. San Francisco's 1906 earthquake and subsequent fires eliminated municipal archives. In each case, the disasters were catastrophic but conveniently comprehensive, destroying precisely the documents that would have established genealogical and historical continuity. Even more suspicious, the pattern of what survived. Architectural drawings for grand public buildings often exist, while documentation for the far more numerous residential structures rarely does. Commercial building permits are preserved, but private home construction records are absent. We can trace the design evolution of public libraries and civic halls, but the actual houses where people supposedly lived appear in the historical record as accomplished facts, not documented processes. Newspapers from the era show awareness of these gaps. An 1873 editorial in the New York Times questions the absence of construction documentation for entire neighborhoods that appeared seemingly overnight. One might wonder if these structures were built by human hands at all. So swift was their appearance, and so scarce the evidence of their making. The editorial was not followed up. The question was not pursued. Why? The systematic nature of the erasure suggests intentionality. Random destruction would leave random gaps. Instead, we see selective preservation, official narratives intact, alternative evidence destroyed. The construction timeline that makes logical sense, buildings that required decades to build, gives way to official timelines compressed into years. The demographic records that would explain population origins are absent. The genealogical documentation that would connect present inhabitants to documented ancestors systematically fails at the crucial juncture. This isn't accident. This is curation. For those who trace their ancestry, the implications are profound. Genealogical research typically reaches a barrier in the mid-19th century. Researchers familiar with this phenomenon attribute it to incomplete record keeping in earlier eras, but the pattern is too consistent. Family trees extend back clearly through the 18th century, showing documented births, marriages, deaths. Then, between roughly 1840 and 1870, the chain breaks. Origins become vague. Immigration records show arrival but no departure documentation from home countries. Ancestors appear in census records without prior mention, as if manifesting from nowhere. This creates a genealogical orphaning affecting entire populations. We cannot verify our connections to the pre-reset world because the documentation that would establish those connections has been removed. Are we descendants of survivors, of people brought in to repopulate, of entirely different populations than we believe? Without continuous records, identity itself becomes uncertain. The emotional cost extends beyond individual family mysteries. It fractures our understanding of cultural continuity. Italian Americans trace heritage to Italian immigrants, but if those immigrants' documentation is suspect, what does Italian American identity actually mean? Irish American, German American, all the hyphenated identities that form cultural bedrock in the United States. All rest on immigration narratives that cannot be fully verified through the systematic gaps in records. If we accept even the possibility that history was reconstructed, every institution that teaches that history becomes suspect. Educational systems derive their authority from presumed access to truth. Governments claim legitimacy through historical continuity. Cultural institutions preserve and transmit narratives that may be false. The entire framework of trust that allows complex societies to function rests on shared understanding of the past. If that understanding is manufactured, the trust becomes questionable. The photograph of the children's home remains in the municipal archives. The three blurred faces continue to resist explanation. In context with the missing census years, the undocumented orphan origins, the impossibly swift appearance of grand architecture, those blurred faces whisper a question that cannot be silenced. Were these children really orphans, or were they inhabitants of a previous world, being processed into the new one? What other evidence remains hidden, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was deliberately made invisible?